In 2001, Rockstar Games released Grand Theft Auto 3 for 6th-generation consoles. The game's open-world concept was nothing short of revolutionary, and it launched the M-rated title into the mainstream practically overnight. Even in the face of unprecedented backlash and controversy, the game was a commercial hit and a cultural phenomenon.
Since it was released 9 months ago, Grand Theft Auto 3 has sold 3.5 million copies at $50 per.
Rockstar quickly followed up with Grand Theft Auto Vice City in 2002 and Grand Theft Auto San Andreas later on in 2004. Each installment deepened and sophisticated the model for this new kind of game, and by the mid-decade, the franchise was a household name. It wasn't long before the whole industry could see the writing on the wall. Open-world crime games were the next big thing, and so everybody was gonna make one. Before Grand Theft Auto had made Rockstar a major player in console gaming, Electronic Arts enjoyed almost complete dominance of the market. From sports games to driving sims to shooters and beyond, EA had left its mark in just about every relevant corner of the industry at this point in the early 2000s. But it had no presence in the world of mature gaming. Remember, this was the age of the T for Teen title. Still, the company was confident that it could make inroads with Rockstar's audience, because while the other guys had to tinker with the formula to make their GTA clones stand out, EA had a different card to play. It was big enough and valuable enough as a company to land an expensive movie license. See, you have to remember that in those days, every new movie, every current TV show, and every brand of toy had its own video game. Like, half of all the games you could buy were based on something else. That's just the way it was. Slapping your film or your TV show license onto a video game was always good business. And if you had a particularly big budget, high profile license, then giving it to EA was good business too. The company had published the Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings movie tie-ins, as well as some of the post-GoldenEye 007 games like Nightfire. So with this in mind, Paramount Pictures approached EA in late 2002 about a video game based on Francis Ford Coppola's 1972 gangster epic, The Godfather. Realizing that this was their chance to break into the M-rated market, EA agreed and began work on a third-person, open-world action title based on the movie. Now, they weren't the first, or the last, to notice that classic crime films were well-suited to the GTA model, but with The Godfather specifically, EA had gotten its hands on a top-shelf IP. It was not only the gold standard of the mob genre, it was widely held to be one of the greatest films ever to come out of Hollywood. If any franchise had the sheer cultural weight needed to displace the Grand Theft Auto juggernaut, then this was it. Development began around early 2003 and included a full year of research to get the team familiar with the franchise canon. This might have even still been going on when in March 2004, EA's chief financial officer Warren Jensen just straight up leaked the project like a year early. In a speech at a media conference in Palm Beach, Warren said, "I think many of you know that we are developing The Godfather, which will likely be an M-rated game." He was totally wrong about the first part, but in the days following, media focused coverage mostly on the M rating. Everybody agreed that EA's move into the adult-oriented market would send shockwaves through the industry. One financial analyst put it more bluntly, "God save us if EA actually wakes up and wants to make mature content. If that happens, there's only going to be one company left." EA never acknowledged the leak and kept quiet for 9 months. Until at the Spike Video Game Awards in December, where Tony Hawk was naming San Andreas Game of the Year.
Rockstar Games has done it again. Ladies and gentlemen, Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas.
EA finally officially confirmed the title with this boring pre-rendered teaser that nobody really liked. See, since the project had already been leaked, people had questions that this trailer didn't answer. Namely, would this game be like Grand Theft Auto? And a month later, EA would answer that question, but again kind of offhandedly, and this time in Japanese for some reason. In January 2005, senior producer Hunter Smith told Tokyo-based gaming magazine Famitsu, and nobody else, that it would be like Grand Theft Auto. But unlike GTA, which Smith said lacked story, The Godfather would have a strong background based on human relationships. More on that later. By the next month, the rollout finally seemed to be finding its footing. EA announced that the game would release that fall, and it confirmed that James Caan, Robert Duvall, and even the late Marlon Brando would all reprise their film roles, the latter having recorded dialogue before his death in 2004. Notably absent from the game's cast was Al Pacino, who portrayed the film's protagonist Michael Corleone, and who, probably even more than Brando, was the face of the franchise. It's commonly held that Pacino wasn't involved because he'd already agreed to lend his likeness to Vivendi's Scarface adaptation. I'm speculating here, but I don't think that's what happened. It's hard to say exactly, but the Godfather game appears to have been in development before Scarface, and given that Pacino was the film's star, it seems likely that EA would have approached him early on, before Vivendi did. But for whatever reason, he declined to lend his voice or his likeness to the game. And with the cat well and fully out of the bag by this point, EA held a star-studded red carpet event in New York's Little Italy to officially introduce the game to the public and the press for the 4th time. But things finally seemed to be going well, and by this point, the media had mostly warmed up to the title. Even the New York Times seems to take the project at face value, but I wondered who the game's intended audience was, writing, "The question for Electronic Arts is whether video game players raised on the more explicit milieu of Grand Theft Auto will respond to the Baroque style of The Godfather." But not only was EA still convinced that it could beat Rockstar at its own game.
Well, I mean, I'll specifically focus on kind of the king of the hill, on Grand Theft Auto. I think what it's safe to say is that in this category of games, we feel like there's significant room for innovation.
It finally started pushing back on the idea that The Godfather would be just another movie adaptation. We're told that while the story will play out in the world of the film, it'll be an original one, featuring an original character, and that the player's decisions would determine that character's fate. While there was no playable demo at this point, the game as presented looked pretty good. This footage is bad, but in some instances, this version of the game looks better than the final product. Work continued quietly through the spring, and things seemed to be running smoothly until April, when Godfather director Francis Ford Coppola went on AMC's Sunday Morning Shootout to just take a big crap on the whole project. There doesn't appear to be video of this anywhere online, but he's quoted as saying, "I knew nothing about it. They never asked me if I thought it was a good idea. What they do is they use the characters everyone knows, and they hire those actors to be there, and then for the next hour they shoot and kill each other." Coppola wasn't alone in his objections, and as the industry geared up for its biggest event of the year, the complaints were growing louder.
All right, sure you expect movies like Chronicles of Riddick and Batman Begins to get the video game treatment, but it's a little surprising to see an Academy Award-winning drama turned into polygons.
By the time E3 rolled around in May, The Godfather didn't just need to stand out among GTA clones. It also had to fight for recognition in an increasingly crowded field of classic movie adaptations. Vivendi's Scarface, WBI's Dirty Harry, Majesco's Jaws and Taxi Driver, and even Rockstar's own offering The Warriors were all on display that year. It was clear, at least to the media, that The Godfather's core gimmick was close to being played out before the game had even shipped. But remember, The Godfather won't just be a movie game.
Well, what we're trying to do is really give Godfather its own interactive space, right? We're not trying to do the game of the movie. We're trying to put you in that world and let you feel what it's like to be a mobster.
And on the bright side, the E3 version of the game seemed to live up to the hype that EA had been building. While the game was clearly far from finished, critics praised the gunplay and the melee combat. IGN went as far as saying that if any game has a good chance of being the Grand Theft Auto killer so many want to be, it's The Godfather. And so, with expectations set high, EA came out of E3 with a renewed work ethic and a commitment to meeting the standards of quality we've all Nah, I'm just kidding, they kept screwing it up. On Sunday, July 10th, a bombshell New York Times report revealed that Marlon Brando's voice work wouldn't appear in the final game at all, contradicting earlier reports and kicking off what would soon go down as one of the worst weeks in the company's history. It turned out that while Brando had recorded dialogue, the sound engineers couldn't use it because his oxygen tanks were too loud. They had to hire an impersonator instead. The Times piece then takes it in this weird direction about EA's own cultural prestige, which I think is actually pretty instructive. The company is trying to earn the respect of two very different audiences: players who doubt that a game based on a movie can ever be as exciting as an original one, and traditionalists who doubt that a video game can ever have the richness of a book or a film. More broadly, the Godfather team seems to be approaching this multi-million-dollar project as a high-stakes opportunity to earn some respect, not only for itself, but also for the entire notion of gaming. Now this is very, very stupid, but keep in mind that it's July 2005, which means that the Grand Theft Auto hot coffee scandal is just about reaching its peak. At a time when the competition was at the center of an honest-to-God moral panic, EA is trying to frame the Godfather game as a title that aspires to be art. That might free them from a certain kind of scrutiny, but it also comes with its own set of expectations, as we'll see. At any rate, EA had loudly and repeatedly touted the game as Marlon Brando's final performance, so his absence was a major embarrassment. That was on Sunday. On Thursday of that week, EA pushed back The Godfather's release date from fall 2005 to just sometime in 2006. And within 24 hours, the price of EA stock tumbled by 5%. Analysts warned of future losses as a direct result of the game's delay. Now, to be fair to EA, 2005 was shaping up to be a rough year for the industry across the board, mostly because the transition to 7th generation consoles meant that sales for current systems were slowing down. But the delay only made things worse for EA, and it would end the year 10% less valuable than it started it. Adding insult to injury, The Godfather's absence in the 2005 holiday season worked out really well for competitors like Rockstar. But after playing damage control following the delay, EA kept its mouth shut for the next 8 months and took its financial beating on the chin. In January 2006, our old friend David DeMartini re-emerged again for a round of interviews, but something big had changed by this point. See if you can spot what it is. Quote, "People want to be involved with the integral parts of the story, with the action with which they're familiar. So your character is amazingly involved in almost every one of the big scenes in the Godfather film. We actually made a conscious choice to involve you in each scene because that's what consumers ultimately want." So instead of the Godfather-inspired open-world RPG that EA had been promising us up to this point, we're now being primed for a crowd-pleasing, by-the-numbers movie adaptation. Let's see how that works out for them. A March release date was confirmed, but the tough times of the console transition had carried over into the new year, and in February, EA announced that it would offer The Godfather, along with Fight Night Round 3 and Black, at a 20% discount on release, in what was obviously a final bid to buoy sales in the middle of a historically sluggish market. But finally, after the death of one of its stars and after being snubbed by another, with a botched reveal, a public feud, an 8-month delay, and a gimmick already wearing thin, The Godfather the Game was released in North America for PS2, Xbox, and PC on March 21st, 2006. The game begins in 1936. You are Aldo Trapani. Your father, Johnny, is a Corleone associate of unspecified rank. You witness his murder at the hands of the Barzini family, up to and including the Don himself. It's apparently payback for some vague disagreement.
Sorry, Johnny. It's just business.
Don Vito Corleone, whose whole job is to dispense street justice, tells you that you're going to have to avenge this thing yourself one day. 9 years pass, it's 1945, and we're at the famous wedding scene. Aldo's mother, Serafina, asks Don Corleone to save you from a life of petty crime. He agrees, and offers you a life of organized crime instead. His enforcer, Luca Brazzi, takes Aldo under his wing, showing him how to extort a business, bribe a cop, and shoot a gun, before sneaking off for a polyamorous date with Sollazzo and Bruno Tattaglia. Things are just starting to get hot and heavy when Luca is murdered. Around this time, on the first of many missions that call back to scenes from the film, the player meets Paulie Gatto, a movie character, and Monk Malone, an EA original. In this mission, the trio avenges the daughter of Bonacera, the funeral home director from the film's opening scene. And this is a good example of what I like to call a follow-up mission. It doesn't play through an event that was depicted in the film, but it follows up on one. It fills in the blanks of the movie. Well-executed follow-up missions are often the best that this game's story has to offer, and even here, where it's basically another tutorial mission, it works pretty well. Also, it's a little cheesy, but there's an immediate dynamic established with this group that feels intentional. There's Paulie the ballbuster, Aldo with something to prove, and Monk the cool-headed peacekeeper. In what will come to be a familiar motif, this new, interesting relationship between the three is never visited again. After avenging Luca's death, the player finds Monk in the barbershop, and we're treated to the same assassination scene that we saw in early promotional material. The Don has been shot, and it's up to you to make sure he gets somewhere safe. We also formally meet Frankie after saving her life. Monk's sister and Aldo's love interest, Frankie is both obviously close with her brother and immediately interested in you. We learn that about her here, and we never learn another thing about her again. Shortly after this, we get the first of the story mode's many jarring missteps. As we careen through lower Manhattan, escorting Don Vito to the hospital, Fredo Corleone hangs out of the side of the car, lobbing pot shots at the pursuing Tattaglias with his trusty .38. Now this isn't just out of character, it doesn't make any sense. Fredo's weak and cowardly nature is supposed to be a major plot point here. Paulie Gatto, the Don's usual chauffeur, has betrayed the Corleones by calling in sick at the last minute, specifically so that the only thing standing between Vito and certain doom was this guy. Fredo still screws up at the moment of truth, just as the plot requires, but it doesn't take him long to, regain his composure. This is the first example of what will come to be a recurring issue with the game, the dissonance between the demands of the movie plot and action-oriented gameplay. But after that, the player gets promoted from total outsider to unofficial enforcer. Aldo is still not a made man, and very little changes. You get a bigger paycheck, but that's it. Still, this moment achieves a neat effect. It really does feel like, in the chaos since these attacks, that the family needs manpower and Aldo's been deputized. It's a rare instance of Aldo's story and the film's events actually informing and affecting one another. Later on at the hospital, we meet Sonny, Frankie again, and clearly not Al Pacino, so please don't sue us, Michael. The player kills like 24 more would-be assassins, saving Vito's life again before Michael gets whacked. After this mission, the game is pretty much finished trying to weave its original story with the movie-based missions. From here on out, for better or worse, Aldo's personal life plays out separately from the events of the film. Later on, when the local precinct busts a Corleone New Year's party, Aldo leaves a trail of 11 bodies before carefully framing the murder of one guy as an accident. Aldo's target here, Sergeant Galtacino, serves as the game's first, lowest-level antagonist. He's your archetypal, corrupt beat cop with a sadistic streak. That's our first impression, and the game never really bothers making a second one. Still, I think he works well as an antagonist for the game's opening chapters. Aldo, at this point, to the extent that he's characterized at all, is a small-time gangster who believes in his code. He obeys the laws of his world. A crooked, predatory cop is a great foil for him. Galtacino is a petty guy who commits petty crimes, but it all scales with the low stakes of the first act, and I like it. From here, the game's story settles into its core dynamic. We play a scene from the movie, but with a twist. Kill the traitor, Polygato, but twist, there's explosions. Put the horse head in Jack Woltz's bed, but twist, there's a lot of strangling. Some of these missions leave the film's story intact, and those ones work quite well. Others change the story and drag out a sequence from the film in the name of action-oriented gameplay. But in both cases, they're only there to move the film's plot along. Sometime later, Monk tells us in a bar that he knows about Aldo and Frankie, and for some reason Aldo gets defensive and bashful like a child. The relationship between Aldo and the Malones will become the primary focus of the game's original story, so it's weird that this opportunity isn't taken to make these guys seem like friends, or that they even like each other. Aldo sees Frankie for the third time ever when the two apparently move in together. As if that wasn't weird enough, your boss's lawyer is here because apparently it was his idea. Frankie actually has a sad little throwaway line here that I think is emblematic of the game's total disinterest in her character.
I thought maybe we could go to that swanky new nightclub in Little Italy. We could go now or later.
This is the first time these two have ever seen each other without Aldo killing somebody. They never go to the club, and she never spawns in the apartment again. But back to the core rhythm of the game. Michael kills Sollozzo, but twist, this time there's a lot more shooting. As with Fredo earlier, we're treated to a high-speed car chase, and Michael Corleone is just going to town with a Tommy gun. For context, this moment in the story is supposed to represent Michael's full entry into the criminal underworld. In an instant, he and his life have changed forever. In the movie, anyway. In the game, Sollozzo and McCluskey are just a good start. Again, the mission's gameplay doesn't really follow from the story, and the dramatic weight of Michael's act is lost when he does this. More importantly, though, I think these kind of slip-ups almost make Aldo pointless as a character. Why would EA make us play as some guy who's not even in the movie if they're comfortable doing this with Michael Corleone? Wasn't the whole point of Aldo to spare canonical characters like Michael from getting the GTA treatment? The mission ends, and for his role in the killing of Sollozzo, Aldo is finally, officially a made man. The film is Michael's story, but this is supposed to be Aldo's, and the game wants these two characters to mirror each other, to make their arcs run parallel to one another. The game is laying the groundwork for that here, as the Sollozzo hit marks both men's official induction into the family. This whole ceremony is another cutscene mission without any action, but in an uncharacteristically lucid moment, it takes the opportunity to linger, to contemplate what's happened up to this point. Like the wedding at the beginning and the baptism at the end, this ceremony is a sacrament. It's a holy ceremony and it's a milestone in Aldo's life, but the tone isn't celebratory. War is coming, and you can feel it in the room. No one's in the mood to party, and so nothing happens. The circumstances are just allowed to sink in. We're left to consider Aldo's rise against the backdrop of the spiraling Corleone family, and for a second here, the game achieves what it set out to do. Aldo's story and the events of the film are intertwined in a way that strengthens and deepens them both. But it doesn't last long, and the fourth time we see Frankie, she's kidnapped and dies after apparently springing a leak. Monk is distraught, and as we leave him to say his goodbyes, there's this totally unearned emotional low point. Frankie's first appearance was at E3, where she was a prop for the barbershop shootout, and the developers never really managed to make her much more than that. She loves her brother, she loves her boyfriend, and then she dies. she doesn't really have a part to play in the story, but she's written to be sort of self-aware in order to preempt you from noticing any of that.
There's nothing I hate more than playing the damsel in distress.
Again, the game wants Aldo's character to mirror Michael, and as such, Aldo's relationship with Frankie is a lot like Michael's relationship with Apollonia, the woman that he marries in Sicily. These women, lacking any agency themselves, represent the men's innocence, their last cherished ties to a world beyond organized crime. But when their lovers are killed, the men harden their hearts and commit fully to the life. This works in the movie because we see Michael love Apollonia. We see Michael build this idyllic, pastoral life free from the pressures of his family dynasty. And so when Apollonia dies from a blast meant to kill Michael, we understand what that means for him. The dream is over. He has to go home to serve his family. In the game, we're just told that Aldo loves Frankie, sort of. Aldo himself lacks any clear motivation. He never says what he wants, and certainly doesn't say anything about Frankie. He meets her 4 times, and then she dies. We never get close enough to her or to Aldo to appreciate the way this loss affects his character moving forward. From here on out, the game continues to commit to this idea of Aldo mirroring Michael, but it never really comes together, in part because this crucial beat of the story is so badly flubbed. So Frankie is dead, but unlike Don Vito, Don Sonny doesn't make us wait for our revenge. He sends us to kill Bruno Tattaglia because apparently he's the one who had her killed. And so we kill Bruno, who doesn't really have anything interesting to say. He doesn't explain why he had a civilian murdered, especially just some guy's girlfriend in the middle of like a citywide power struggle. Instead, he just says he killed her because he's twisted like that. It's supposed to be cathartic as we throw him into the cremation oven. It's not. The game's first antagonist, Sergeant Galtacino, was a natural enemy for Aldo, and so even if their relationship wasn't deep, it made sense. They don't bother to make Bruno make sense. He appears twice, he only talks the second time, and he only says these generically evil things.
You got no chance. You're a dead man, my friend.
Bruno Tattaglia as a villain isn't a failure of concept either. He's a very small character in the film as well, but he's got this weirdly menacing presence on screen. I think he would have made a good antagonist for the game's sagging middle section if they had bothered to follow through on that. Instead, he just pops up to kill someone Aldo loves and to jerk the plot forward. So he ends up unmemorable, and the end of Aldo and Frankie's story is somehow unpoetic. Soon after, Aldo joins Sonny on a rampage through Hell's Kitchen, and the long slog of combat here is supposed to be a stand-in for the mob war that's raging at this point in the story. It's one of the better follow-up missions, and one of the better missions all around. Unlike your other escapades with the Corleone kids, this one feels grounded in terms of characterization. Sonny is a mobster. He gets his hands dirty. It makes sense. The scale of the violence here also finally corresponds to the narrative. It's wartime, and it feels like it. It's also cool to see Sonny operate as acting Don, and to see his distinctively aggressive leadership style be deployed successfully. That's something that even the film never really gets into. At the end of the mission, when the two share some banter, it all feels earned. Sonny didn't always like Aldo. At first, he sees him as an annoyance, and then as a low-level grunt, and then he celebrates your initiation. Aldo's relationship with Sonny might be the most well-developed one he has, and all of its little moments throughout the game culminate here. It all works pretty well. But when it seems like the two of you are about to do it all again, Sonny is killed by 11 of the same guy. In the film, he's going to beat up his brother-in-law, but that's not mentioned at all here. You'd better have seen the movie because the game will never explain what just happened. What comes next is a low-tier follow-up mission. We chase the assassins, we kill them, we interrogate a guy, we go where he says, we kill more henchmen, and then we interrogate another guy. We learn a major plot point from a very generic-looking enemy, that Barzini is the true power behind the Tattaglia family. In the movie, that's a big reveal, but in the game it's just kind of brushed off. Aldo doesn't even tell anybody. So we get to the big sit-down, and Aldo is again hilariously just chilling in the background. And the game finally bothers to pick back up on the plotline about avenging his father's murder. Now would be the perfect time to tell us why Aldo's dad was killed, but the game never does. Instead, Aldo does the Kubrick stare to remind us about the whole thing. Otherwise, things go along as they do in the movie. The war will come to an end. Soon after, Michael sends Aldo to meet Monk and sniff out an FBI agent. Monk has other ideas because it turns out he's a rat. And also kind of a traitor for another family. They never really pick a lane. A totally unique NPC who we've never seen before and will never see again shows up to give us the news. Then Michael orders Aldo to commit murder over the phone in an FBI field office. When we catch up with Monk, he's jaded about Frankie's death and his stalling career. Aldo calls Monk out as a fake friend and ghosts him. If we think of Aldo as an analog for Michael, then it seems like there was an effort to make Monk serve a similar purpose as Fredo in the second movie. Let me explain. In that film, Fredo's been sidelined from the family business because he's dumb and weak. He gets bitter about it, and he turns his back on the family for his own personal gain. Monk is also branded an outsider for things beyond his control. In his case, his Irish ethnicity means that he'll never be a made man. Fredo is jealous that his younger brother inherited his father's throne and feels like he was passed over. Monk feels the same way. He's taken a bullet to the neck and now his sister's dead, and yet it's Aldo who's made his way into the inner circle. It's Aldo, this hot-headed kid who got his mom's permission to be in the mafia. Monk also goes rogue and betrays the family, and in both cases, when Michael kills Fredo, and when Aldo kills Monk, it's supposed to represent each man's final spiritual doom. They've both killed a member of their family in service of the family. It's a moral defeat. But in the game, this barely even registers as subtext. For one, Aldo and Monk haven't spent nearly enough time together for this to carry the dramatic weight that it's supposed to. And two, Monk's betrayal isn't handled with any ambiguity. There's no sense that Aldo murdering his best friend should complicate our understanding of his rise to power. There's no feeling that he's reached the top, but at what cost. Monk just had it coming. On with the movie. After Monk is killed, Don Vito dies off-screen, and another traitor, Sal Tessio, is up next in one of the dumbest missions of the whole game. See, in the film, Tessio plans on having Michael assassinated at a meeting. He gets caught, and then they take him away to kill him. In the game, all of that happens, but then you still take him to the meeting where the setup was going to take place. It makes no sense. Finally, we arrive at the baptism. In the film, all four rival Dons are killed simultaneously in a coup that consolidates Michael's power and elevates him to national prominence in the criminal underworld. In the game, Aldo kills each Don one by one, while Michael goes to church before disappearing forever. Even though this robs the scene of its majesty and makes no sense, there's already a guy ready to do each one of these hits. Why do I have to do it? It's still probably the most fun mission in the game, so I'll forgive it. When it's time to kill Barzini, he calls back to the beginning of the game by again speaking in vague cliches.
I knew it. I knew it would be you.
Yeah, I still have no idea what this is about, man. Sorry. You can finish Barzini off quickly and cleanly like in the movie, or you can push the game's combat mechanics to their limits and really make him pay. But fittingly, it doesn't matter which you do, and you're left feeling somehow unsatisfied either way. Barzini functions as the game's main antagonist, but even more so than the other ones, he's totally without substance. We see him 3 times, and we know pretty much nothing about what he's been doing for the last 20 years. All we know is that he killed Aldo's father for some inscrutable reason, and that he's in control of the Tattaglia family. His scenes bookend the game, but he has no real presence in the plot. As a result, the game has no real villain. No one slows Aldo down or complicates his journey to the top. The story is just about his unstoppable rise. The enemy is time, and these same 2 guys. I keep coming back to the idea that Aldo is the game's version of Michael, that they experience the same fundamental story beats. Like, when Michael's arc begins, he doesn't want to join the family business, but he sees that as long as his family has enemies, he and they are in danger. So he assumes power to protect his loved ones. In the end, he eliminates all of his enemies, but which family has he really saved? Aldo, on the other hand, is a natural crook. He works hard for the family because he wants to. He finds success, but by the time he realizes the true cost of his rise to the top, it's too late. These men have different journeys, but they end up similarly isolated. That's not a bad idea for an adaptation, but it's badly executed. For one, there's no connective tissue to give the events of Aldo's life any significance. Things happen, and they're never really mentioned again. He doesn't tell anyone what he thinks about anything, and almost never does the game encourage you to mull it over for yourself. Aldo is a blank slate, and as a result, the beats of his story never accumulate into a recognizable narrative. Instead, they get lost in the game's big movie moments, which dominate the main story's runtime while Aldo's life plays out on the margins. Without a focused narrative, we're really just left with the story of the War of the 5 Families, and that story never really coheres with Aldo's. The filmic parts of the game are just spectacle. They're like theme park rides, really. Race to the hospital on the Don's Wild Ride, or get the high score at Sunny's Shooting Gallery. Like all theme park rides, these missions are unable to tell a convincing story on their own. They can only evoke static moments from a movie that we've already seen. After completing the missions, the player can unlock the 3 alternate endings that EA said would be determined by our playstyle. In reality, the endings aren't exclusive. You can get one, and then the other, and then the other by completing all the game's side content, which means they're not really endings at all. They're more like off-ramps for players who want closure without having to put in the 50 hours needed to 100% the game. Aldo can finish as an underboss for Michael, as the Don himself, or as the Don of all of New York. Oh my god, it's all that one guy! Nothing much changes after these endings, except, again, for the amount of money you get to take home. But currency has lost all usefulness at this point in the game, so it's not really worth doing. Similarly, you get unlimited ammo as the Don of New York City, but there's of course no one left to shoot. And in each case, Aldo appears to be unambiguously happy with his life choices. The game's map is deceptively small. The 5 neighborhoods are separated by long bridges and tunnels and streets, but they aren't very large, and there are a lot of buildings and landmarks that you can't actually get to. There's no road there. It creates an illusion of a much bigger map than is really in play, and it's mostly an effective one, but the game is again implying depth that it doesn't really offer. And after we've seen it do the same thing with its story missions, it's hard not to feel cynical about that. Still, the neighborhoods do feel distinct and mostly evocative of their real-life counterparts. Brooklyn looks like Brooklyn. Lower Manhattan has a seedy mid-century charm, and the architecture in Midtown is pretty impressive. NPCs will react to the player's exploits in a given neighborhood with their idle chatter. These elements add some life to the game, but the sameness of the building textures and the dark color palette really start to take their toll. Each neighborhood corresponds to a rival family. The higher-level Barzini and Cuneo families rule the sprawling northern sections of the map, while the lowly Strachis in New Jersey and Tatalias in Brooklyn lord over their fiefdoms in isolation. The Corleones, confusingly, don't start with control over any neighborhood. The Tatalias are somehow both the weakest family in the game and hold the most territory. It makes sense from a game design perspective, it gives you more to do, but it again makes the gameplay feel far removed from the world of the film, and it contributes to this dreary sense that you're the only one who makes things happen. The game is supposed to take place over a decade, but you wouldn't know it. The map looks the same for all 4 seasons through all 10 years. The weather is only ever gray, and day and night aren't even all that distinct. Moreover, the game feels totally disinterested in grounding itself in the post-war era. There are no references or pop culture that evokes that period in time. It's all just vaguely old school. It's not 1946, it's just the 40s. You'll spend a huge amount of time driving in this game because it's 2006 and there is no fast travel. Despite being a core gameplay element, driving feels like an afterthought. There's only 5 vehicles available to you, with a few more in the 7th generation versions. Your options range from slow and resilient to speedy and extremely fragile. The result is that getting around becomes very boring very quickly. Other than where they're from and how well they fight, there's not much distinguishing the game's 4 enemy factions. They all share the same few character models with the same few lines of dialogue in the same voice, and they all use the same weapons. It gets old fast. Like the game's main story villains, its low-level enemies are bland, samey, and unmemorable. Even the leaders of enemy factions aren't entirely unique. 2 of the 4 Dons just look like generic mobsters. And weirdly, lots of these enemies are supposed to be high-ranking members of their families, even though there's literally hundreds of them and you can kill them without consequence. Which brings me back to the weird dissonance between the game's narrative and the actual mechanical experience of playing it. The Godfather takes place in a world where violence is a careful business calculation, as long as your target is a unique NPC and not one of these guys. It all feels arbitrary. The gunplay itself can be fun and challenging, and the array of weaponry feels mostly appropriate. The cover system is inexact and touchy because it is 2006, but enemy AI is tricky without being annoying. The auto-aim isn't perfect enough to make things too simple, and the environments are designed to require quick changes of tactic, rewarding the player for having a well-rounded arsenal. It's immersive, and it can honestly be a lot of fun. The much-hyped Blackhand melee system is mostly charming, if not always satisfying. The throws and grabs are more effective and natural than the punches, which often lack grace. The analog control system, though, is articulate, and the grabby, pummely fighting style feels appropriate for a mobster. The context-sensitive slams and melee weapons add to this effect. Outside of the missions, you'll spend most of your time seizing enemy businesses and painting the map. Even though this is the bulk of the game's side content, there's no dynamism to it. Any business you take over belongs to the Corleones permanently. To make up for this, there's like 100 of them, and you'll have to fight for almost every single one. It's here where the game's famous pressure system shines. You push a shopkeep too far and it'll crack, but you push him just enough and it'll work for you. The whole system functions more or less the way EA said it would, where the right amount of force is rewarded. And that's pretty unique. However, every merchant is protected by like 5 enemies that you're gonna have to kill. so it never really feels like you're exercising restraint. Each merchant has a weak spot, and the player gets a reward for finding it, but most of them are the same. Don't break my stuff, don't punch me, don't shoot me, etc. With the amount of map painting the game already wants you to do, it's hard to care about individualizing the experience for each NPC, and with all the combat you'll have to do to get there, it sort of saps your energy for the DIY roleplay that's being asked of you. Warehouses and hubs, the larger extortable businesses, function the same way as storefronts and rackets, but they're cordoned off with roadblocks and they're packed with dozens of higher-level enemies. The assaults on these venues are even more violent and gamey than the smaller ones, but the scale of the warehouses makes the combat feel justified for once. You won't get very far completing any side content without bribing the police. Doing so will keep you safe for a short amount of time, and the higher ranking the cop, the longer you're safe. It's not very sophisticated, and it's way too cheap for how effective it is. In addition to trouble with the law, too much aggression in the open world can spark a mob war with an enemy family. Not the mob war that the entire game is about. A different, less important kind. Whatever. In a mob war, the enemy family you've ticked off will chase you down and bomb your businesses until you can do the same to one of theirs. It's extremely annoying. This mechanic is supposed to temper your ability to just wipe out enemy factions in one go, and to add some depth to your freelance exploits, but in practice it feels more like punishment for trying to complete the game too quickly. Your other option to end a mob war is to bribe an FBI agent. The idea is that the feds turn up the heat on the other family so that they're too busy in court to bother you anymore, I think. It's not really well explained, but still, I'm glad this was included. As we know, Don Corleone carries politicians in his pocket, like so many nickels and dimes. And the looming presence of Washington and of America's more legitimate institutions is always just off-screen in the films. The feds in the game still have this video gamey role, but their presence at least feels true to the source material. Still, bribing law enforcement of any kind is so often necessary and so lacking in depth that it eventually just becomes another chore. Aldo can assassinate ranking members of the rival families through the hit contract missions. Targets appear in the open world, and you have the leeway to approach each situation as you see fit, but you'll get a much bigger reward for completing the hit a certain way, so you might as well do that. There's a little bit of the dissonance here. Oh, this guy's a captain with the Tatalias? So were all these guys, so what makes him a big deal? Like the story missions, the hit contracts can feel like they're taking place in a different world than the one Aldo actually lives in. Regardless, they're pretty fun, and they're a good distraction from the grind of the freelance work. The backstories and unique conversations for each hit target really do go a long way to fill in the open world, and it all works so well that it feels like a remnant of the early days of development. But no matter what you're doing, the game uses two primary incentives to get you to do it: money and respect. You get paid every week, and that pay goes up when you control more businesses and when you get promoted. To help you spend your earnings, black market merchants are scattered around the map offering ammunition and weapons upgrades. But these upgrades are stupid expensive, specifically to make up for the fact that they're the only things in the game worth buying. You can purchase safe houses across the map, which make life a little easier when you're taking down a neighborhood, but you really only need one per area, and 3 of them are just given to you. The only thing left to buy are clothes, and the game's full wardrobe can be yours for like $200K. This feature is actually very well done, though. You get a broad array of options, and most of them feel like they belong with their surroundings. I only bring that up because these character customization options are honestly a bright spot in the game. But once you've bought all that, there's not much else to do. Money is your motivation to complete most of the game, but when there's nothing left to spend it on, there's no point in playing anymore. Respect, the other dumb incentive system, functions as the game's XP stat. Aldo earns respect through combat, melee more so than gunplay, and through completing story and side content. When your respect is low, NPCs are rude, and the police may refuse your bribes. When you're more respected, you're more respected. It's not dynamic. Your respect never goes down, no matter what you do. It can only go up, and it more or less does so on its own. Respect points can be allocated on the skill tree. This is the only time the rubber hits the road in terms of the respect system having an actual effect on gameplay, but still, it misses the mark. You'll almost certainly max out each skill by the end of a normal playthrough, so it's less like designing your build for Aldo and more like manually leveling up. None of this is substantially different than what was explained in development, even early development, but still, the respect system plays like an afterthought, and it feels like a missed opportunity. With all of this in mind, it's actually pretty depressing to look back at the way the game was being described in early development. Not just that we were supposed to get a more fleshed out original story, but that we were supposed to get an honest-to-God mafia role-playing game. In 2005, EA was saying that the player could decide whether Aldo would be a skilled negotiator like Tom Hagen, or a thug like Sonny, or some shrewd combination of the two like Don Vito. They said that there would be consequences for our actions, and that even our own family would punish us for playing it too fast and loose. They said that cars and fashion would evolve over the game's 10-year period, that we could hire crew members with specialized skills, that the way we played the game would determine Aldo's fate. We didn't get any of that. We'll never know exactly why all these more ambitious features were cut, and a lot of them can probably be chalked up to technical limitations and a lack of time, but the game as originally described sounds totally unique, something that still hasn't been made in the 15 years since. The game's original release garnered mostly positive reviews. Critics praised the gunplay and the Blackhand melee system as intuitive and enjoyable, but most agreed that it fell short as an adaptation of the film. Still, audiences embraced the title. While sales continue to lag across the board as a result of the console transition, The Godfather still managed to move 1 million copies in its first 10 days on the market. In its debut week, the game was the first and second most rented title at Blockbuster, which sounds quaint, but I promise that was a big deal back then. The aforementioned 7th generation releases began making their way into stores before the year's end. The Xbox 360 version, which is what you're seeing now, shipped in September 2006, followed by a PSP version that cut almost all of the open world content and which nobody liked. In 2007 came the PS3 Don's Edition, which is widely considered the best version, and the Wii's Blackhand Edition, which isn't as good but had the coolest box art by far. Look at that. It's sick. In addition to the extra story missions, the 7th gen versions had some improved graphics, some extra side content, and even the ability to hire a crew for the freelance mode, which is actually pretty cool. I don't think we're dealing with fundamentally different games here, so I'm not going to spend much time drawing distinctions between the different versions, but the newer editions are universally regarded as better games. Still, by this point it was roundly acknowledged that the game, in all its iterations, had failed to live up to the Godfather license. Even with all the improvements, it just wasn't a great game. And that was the game's legacy until very recently. But it's kind of had a comeback in recent years. Since Let's Plays and YouTube essayism have come into vogue, the game has been quietly rehabilitated as a forgotten, if flawed, classic. It's probably not surprising that I disagree with this. It's not a great game, and half the time it's not even very good. To me, The Godfather is most interesting for the ways in which it failed, as a movie adaptation, as a Grand Theft Auto clone, and as a synthesis of the two. This is the last time I'm gonna say it, I promise. The game uses Aldo to mirror Michael. We get the familiar Godfather story about a criminal rise and a spiritual fall, but from the perspective of this new character. They're different in all the right ways, and the fact that these two characters share a similar fate should help the game preserve the Godfather's thematic essence. The problem is that the game's story is so badly presented that you never really notice how clever that is. And with such a weak narrative at the center, there's nothing to elevate this game beyond its source material. The upshot is that there's no thematic contrast to the rise of the Corleone family in this game. It's not bitter, it's just sweet. It's presented so badly that the game becomes this gross perversion of the film. The Godfather's story becomes one of complete moral victory, and that's like the opposite of the point. But this game was also meant to emulate Grand Theft Auto, to end in the hearts and minds of the public Rockstar's monopoly on the great open world game. And it didn't do that. For one, because its world just isn't very open. You can take your time and roam the map as you please, but there isn't much to do, and when you finally get around to starting an activity, it's usually clear the game wants you to play it a certain way. The game has preferences, and it wants you to know it. In the end, The Godfather is an open world game in fact, but not in spirit. It'll patiently twiddle its thumbs while you do what you want, but that's it. It won't have any part in criminality that it hasn't carefully scripted. And so the game is both a bad GTA clone and not particularly good on its own terms. The boring open world and the bad story never mesh. Now, admittedly, it's probably very hard to make a game like this out of a movie like this, and I don't even know what a perfect version of this game would have looked like. But whether it was an impossible task or just a bad effort, The Godfather can't bring its disparate elements together to create a unified experience. It can't find a way to marry its two premises, the movie adaptation and the GTA clone, so instead it just asks us to accept both of them separately, never allowing either to transcend the works that they're based on. I'm reminded of the New York Times piece from July 2005, specifically the quote about trying to earn the respect of both gamers and traditionalists. Maybe the game's story and its open world never cohere because they weren't meant to, because they were individually designed to please these two separate, imaginary groups. The snobs who wouldn't care if the game was any fun, and the slobs who wouldn't care if the story was any good. In the end, the game failed on every front. It wasn't a good Godfather adaptation, it wasn't a good Grand Theft Auto clone, and even on their own merits, the story and the gameplay are bad. But this game was born of market forces, and ultimately those same forces would spare it from falling into obscurity, because it sold well. Really well. Even in the context of a historically bad year for the video game industry, The Godfather was a commercial hit. And though critics would sour on the game as time went on, EA had already begun considering that this franchise had legs. The days of the console transition, after all, were coming to an end. Maybe without the financial crunch, and maybe without the hardware limitations of the 6th generation, the next game could live up to the original vision. Because, though it was increasingly becoming clear that Rockstar was in a lane of its own, the development and release of The Godfather seemed to have signaled the start of a new wave. The era of the classic movie game.